Our gospel reading this morning is the story of Palm Sunday, as recorded in John's account of Jesus' life. I invite you to stand out of reverence for the words and the works of Jesus. In this reading, John tells how Jesus presented himself as Messiah when he entered Jerusalem, fulfilling prophecy and predicting his impending death. John writes, "The next day, the great crowd that had come for the feast heard that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. They took palm branches and went out to meet him, shouting, 'Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the King of Israel.' Jesus found a young donkey and sat upon it, as it is written, 'Do not be afraid, O daughter of Zion. See, your king is coming, seated on a donkey's colt.' At first, his disciples did not understand all this. Only after Jesus was glorified did they realize that these things had been written about him, and that they had done these things to him. Now the crowd that was with him when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to spread the word. Many people, because they had heard that he had given this miraculous sign, went out to meet him. So the Pharisees said to one another, 'See, this is getting us nowhere. Look how the whole world has gone after him.' Now there were some Greeks among those who went up to worship at the feast. They said to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, with a request. 'Sir,' they said, 'we would like to see Jesus.' Philip went to tell Andrew. Andrew and Philip in turn told Jesus. Jesus replied, 'The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. I tell you the truth. Unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. The man who loves his life will lose it, while the man who hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life.' This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
I invite you all to be seated. Many times, great innovations, things that are going to change the world, are misunderstood and misjudged when they first occur. So, for example, you might know that Thomas Edison's work on the light bulb was told by a contemporary engineering professor that it was a conspicuous failure. I mean, how could we possibly get electricity to people's houses to use this invention? That was in 1897. By 1902, there were automobiles, and yet the experts said it's really an impractical type of thing. There's no way that the common person will ever be able to afford to buy an automobile. Interestingly enough, I found out last year that in my family, only 15 years later, they bought 2 automobiles and a tractor. As recently as 1985, there was an article in the New York Times claiming that laptop computers were just a fad that was passing. In fact, the Times article read like this: "People do not want to lug a computer with them to the beach or on the train to while away the hours, rather than reading the sports or the business section of the newspaper. Somehow, the microcomputer industry assumed everyone would love having a keyboard grafted on as an extension of their fingers. It's just not so." But you know, I know kids, perhaps some of mine, that wouldn't mind having a keyboard grafted onto their fingers, right? How many of you own smartphones, or smart watches, or tablet computers, or a laptop? Yeah, almost all of us. It's only been 40 years. But as I said, oftentimes innovations are misjudged and misunderstood. And I mention that because the story that we just heard, the story that John tells in the gospel, was the beginning of an innovation, a total change that would change our lives, not just by providing convenience through technology. This would be a change in the way that we relate to God. This would be a change that would bring hope, and not just for the self-righteous religious people, but hope for the humble people, the poor, the weak, the people who messed up in life, the people who realize that they themselves are never, ever going to earn their way into God's graces. talk about that hope today because that was the innovation, and there were signs of what Jesus was about to do on Palm Sunday for those who had eyes to see, or at least could understand. For the crowd that had squeezed into Jerusalem for the Passover, which would increase the population of Jerusalem by at least 5 times just for that week. For the crowd that came with Jesus, his followers, who, yet as we hear this passion story, were still clueless about what Jesus was really about. Even for the Greek Jews who had come to the festival, who had come a long way to seek out Jesus, who might have been excluded, and yet he came for them too, and for us. And the first thing I want to point out is that Jesus was a different kind of king. A different kind of king than the world had ever seen. John tells us they took palm branches and went out to meet him, which is what they would have done with the king. And they shouted, Hosanna, which means save us, something you would shout to a deliverer. And they shouted, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, acknowledging that Jesus had the authority of God himself. And they shouted, blessed is the King of Israel, which meant they acknowledged that he was the Messiah, the anointed descendant of David. But he was not the kind of king who would use his power to drive out the occupying Roman army, which would have been what many people would expect. Nor would he depose the evil King Herod, who shouldn't have been king over them anyway, but he was good at politics. And to signal that he was a different kind of king, Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it. This last week, I gave a devotion to kids down in Cascade, and I'm not sure they got it, so I'll try it out on you. What did it mean that Jesus came in on a donkey? Well, I showed them this picture. Anybody remember that picture? Yes. It's from 1988. You might recognize that was Michael Dukakis. He was one of the major party candidates for president. And he had a huge lead in the polls as far as people's votes until this picture. This picture was taken from a video at a press conference before a speech that he was giving. And people saw this picture of him riding around in a tank. And what do you suppose they thought about what kind of president he would be? It was totally the wrong image. He actually, I'm told, gave quite a good speech about the proper use of the military afterwards, but nobody paid attention to the speech, because that's the way we are, right? Images have much more power. And so, after this image was published, his poll numbers dropped. And this next guy, in the next picture, his poll numbers went up. And it's a totally different image, isn't it? Right? Standing in the sunroof of a limousine. He looks like he's reaching out to hug you. Totally different image, along with Barbara. And who could not love Barbara? And of course, we know how it ended, right? Bush won the presidency. And why am I showing you that? Well, at the time of Jesus, if someone were coming as a conqueror, they would look like this next picture. That's a Roman centurion, and in the time of Jesus, horses were the tanks of today. But they were fast, they were powerful, they were frightening, they lifted you up above the fray. Sometimes they themselves were even armored. But that's what a king would ride if he was coming to conquer. What Jesus rode instead was this, a donkey. What kings would ride when they were taking their time. A gentle animal, a slow animal, one that really wouldn't separate them from the crowd, just allow them to be seen. It was a sign that Jesus was coming not to conquer, not to force people, but in peace, to win people over. That's what he was about. And this brought incredible hope to the humble. By humble, I mean those who were poor, those who were struggling in life, those who were old or weak, because it's the humble who invariably suffer when someone comes into a nation and tries to force people through violence, through power, to do their will. Invariably, it's the poor people, the humble people, the people who are the outcasts that suffer. But Jesus came for those people. Not for the self-righteous, high and mighty, but for the humble people. The people who recognize their need for God's mercy. That's how Jesus came. And he brought a different kind of hope. John writes, "Now the crowd that was with him when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to spread the word." This Lazarus was a friend of Jesus, and he was friends with their sisters, and Jesus had raised him from the dead just a relatively short walk from Jerusalem. So this crowd knew this, and they were spreading this news, and it was a different kind of hope. You know, I'm often struck when I do funerals and go to the receptions, or when I'm in crowds of people who are trying to comfort those who've lost loved ones, with the things that people say. They're well-meaning, but they often don't have any real hope at all. You know, you often hear, "He'll live on in our hearts," which is to say, he really is dead. All we have is memories, and in one generation, they'll be gone too. There's no hope in that. You know, you hear about the circle of life, which is to say, we're fertilizer. When we die, that's all we can hope for, is create fertilizer for future generations to feed on. That's not very hopeful. Sometimes I've heard people say, "I saw a butterfly, and I'm sure it was Grandma watching over us," which is a reference to reincarnation, which is this theory that when you die, based on how good you were in this life, you become an animal. Or if you're really good, you might have another chance as a human. And you keep going through this circle of rebirth. You could be a bug, you could be a cow. Eventually, if you're good enough, after thousands of cycles, you might actually reach heaven by being really, really good. And to me, this sounds like the circles of hell. Having to live over and over again and try to be good enough to make it in. Or people will talk about, you know, nirvana, or just vaguely they're in some kind of place and they're floating around in airy nothingness, which is how a lot of the movies depict heaven, which means you lose your individuality, you lose your physicality, you pretty much lose everything you enjoy in this life. But Jesus brought a different kind of hope. A hope that people couldn't wait to spread to others. That he had the power to raise people physically from the dead. And he wouldn't use this power to oppress. He would use this power to renew. You know, right now there are 199 bodies that are in cryogenic freezers in Arizona. I don't know if you're aware of that, but some of them it's just their head, but a lot of them it's their whole body. The hope being that someday we will either develop the ability to bring people back to life or to transplant brains perhaps into robots and they can have another life. But here's the thing. If it's their body, they are still going to be in the same decaying body. Right? And even if it's their brain implanted in some kind of robot, they're still going to be in this world of decay and despair where things go wrong. Right? In fact, there's no guarantee that the power will stay on long enough for that to happen. But these are the things we grasp at because we sense in our hearts that death is wrong, that we're not meant to die. We can talk all we want about, well, this is the circle of life and my time had come. But the Bible tells us we weren't actually made to die. That was not God's original will. And that's the hope that Jesus brought through his death and his resurrection, was the promise that we won't just be trying to make it on our own, in which case I, for one, won't make it. That we won't just be brought back into the same kind of existence, but that we will have a new existence, one in which we are in the presence of God himself. You know, so often people talk about heaven in this kind of vague way. They never mention God, and they never mention righteousness. And what kind of heaven is it if everybody's just as awful as they are here? It's not actually, it can't be heaven. Unless somehow we're purged of our evil, of the sin, of our failures. Unless they're not only forgiven, but taken away. Unless there's a new heaven and a new earth and new bodies that are glorified bodies like Jesus after he rose. Unless there's a new relationship with God and with each other. And that's exactly the hope that Jesus brought. And it wasn't just a hope for the righteous people, those who are deluded into thinking they're good enough to spend eternity with God. It was hope for all of us. And especially for those who are humble before God. Especially for those who realize that they can't possibly make it on their own. Because it's not a gimme, right? It's a gift. It's a gift that was paid for by Jesus. And he came to offer, in addition, a different kind of life. You know, at the end of this passage, we have these Greek Jews who have come for this Passover festival. It's one of three great festivals that in Judaism, if you could possibly make it to Jerusalem, you had to go to Jerusalem and celebrate Passover. So these were Greek-speaking, Greek-cultured Jews who came, and it's always interesting to me, they asked Philip, perhaps because Philip among the disciples had not a Hebraic name, but he had a Greek name. And Philip didn't know what to do. He went to his friend Andrew, and Andrew and Philip together went to Jesus. And Jesus saw the coming of people from all over the world as a sign that his time was come, the time for him to be glorified. To be glorified by God through his resurrection, not just for the Jewish people, but for all of us throughout the world. And then Jesus says something that's I think, one of the most astonishing and difficult passages in the Bible. It's one that's a little hard to understand. It's a warning for the high and mighty, but a promise for the humble. He says, the man who loves his life will lose it, while the man who hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. And we look at that and go, well, are we supposed to be miserable then? And the answer is no. In the Bible, as in many things, there's hyperbole, right? Exaggeration to make a point. And this is hyperbole along the lines of, there's a passage in the Old Testament where God says, Jacob I loved and Esau I hated. Now, Jacob and Esau were twin brothers. And if you read their story, you find out that God did bless Esau as well as Jacob. It's just that Jacob was the one who was chosen to be the heir of Israel. In fact, his name was changed to Israel, which means he struggled with God. Esau didn't really struggle with God. He didn't really pay much attention to God. Jacob struggled with God, and he became the ancestor of all of the Jewish people. And God was showing preference for him. It's not that he hated Esau. It's not that he only loved Jacob. But this was a Jewish way of saying, you know, I love this guy, and I'm showing preference for him. He's my priority. So what does it mean when Jesus says, the man who loves his life will lose it? It means if your priority is this life, is, you know, you only go around once, so grab for the gusto. All you got in mind is, you know, I'm gonna have the best time I can while I can, and I'm not even going to think about that eternal stuff. I'm not even going to think about that spiritual stuff. I'm not going to think about the fact that I might have been created by a God, and if so, I owe him something. Now, instead, I'm just going to focus on me. That's the person who loves their life. Well, the man who hates his life in this world, in other words, the life in this world, as good as it is, doesn't compare to what God has prepared for us. That person will keep it for eternal life. We're not meant to be miserable, just to recognize that this life is temporary. It's fragile. It's broken. It's just the prelude to eternity. In this life, we're separated from God. In the next life, we have the opportunity to be with God, if he's our God. Years ago, I had another pastor point me to a Clint Eastwood movie. It's become my favorite Clint Eastwood movie. How many of you have seen Gran Torino? Have you seen that? Yeah. If you haven't seen it, it's about this guy named Walt Kowalski, who's a Korean War vet who worked his life after the war in an automobile factory, and then he retired, but his wife has died. And he's alienated from his children, and he's a bigot and a grouch, and his neighborhood is being replaced by immigrants, mostly Hmong people from Southeast Asia. And a Hmong family moves in next door to him, and that family is struggling. Their teenage son is being pressured, bullied by a cousin into joining a gang. And in order to be initiated into that gang, he has to complete a task, and that task is he has to steal Walt's prized possession, a Gran Torino muscle car that's in his garage that Walt helped build before he retired, and it's in primo condition. It's really the love of Walt's life. And when the neighbor boy, Tao, goes to steal it, of course he fails, and if Walt had tripped, he would have blown his head off with a shotgun. But the neighboring family believes that their son has dishonored the family name, and they send him over not just to apologize, but he is required to work for Walt for free, doing whatever Walt needs him to do until he has paid off his debt. And through those tasks, Walt and this boy, Tao, become friends of a sort. Walt realizes that this boy has no father, and he tries to teach him to be a man. He realizes he has no prospect in life, and so he gets him a job to help out the family. And when Walt's family comes to visit him, he's so alienated by them, he goes next door to the Hmong family and realizes he has more in culture with them than he does with his own family. And the Hmongs were brought to the United States because they sided with the United States in the Vietnam War. And after the war, their lives were threatened for their allegiance to America, so they were brought here as refugees to find a safe place. But it was a tough transition for them. They had a very different culture. But Walt finds himself actually attracted to that culture. So much so that when that family starts being attacked by the gang, Walt takes it personally. And when this neighbor boy is shot and his sister is kidnapped and abused, Walt takes them to the hospital. And the boy is pleading with Walt for him to retaliate. They have to do something to make his family safe. And Walt responds by locking the boy in his basement and going and getting a shave because he has a plan. He has a plan to make sure that the gang is never a threat to this family again. And that plan requires him to give up his life, to make sure that the gang kills him in the presence of enough witnesses that they will spend the rest of their lives in prison. And in case anybody misses the fact that this is a parable of Jesus, when Walt is gunned down, he throws out his arms like this and is dead on the ground, looking every bit like he's been nailed to a cross. And this movie's final scene is the reading of Walt's will, in which his greedy family gathers. They can't wait to get the money from selling the house, and they're wondering who gets the Gran Torino. And surprisingly, astoundingly, Walt gives the house to the church, and he gives the Gran Torino to Tao, who has become more like his son than any of his blood family. And the final scene is Tao driving the Gran Torino down the road with Walt's dog Daisy beside him. It's a great movie. Because it illustrates that Jesus didn't just come to save us from sin and death. He came to give us a new life, to give us a new start with a new future. And this is what people misunderstood when Jesus rode into Jerusalem. The message of Palm Sunday is that Jesus was a different kind of king, and he brings us a different kind of hope for a different kind of life now and into eternity. And the question that we ask ourselves this week is, what do I need to lay down so that God also raises me up in Jesus? Amen.